Good evening, friends. Hello there. How are you? My name is Tony Pompa. I serve now. I'm an Episcopal priest. I serve now as the Dean and Rector of the Cathedral Church of the Nativity at the corner of 3rd and Wyandotte Street in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And I welcome you this night in gratitude to the Celtic Cultural Alliance in the city of Bethlehem and in the Lehigh Valley, a wonderful grassroots nonprofit organization that connects people of Celtic heritage and also offers Celtic heritage and spirit to any who desire it through cultural events, through education, through the great festival that is known by many and in these COVID times, unfortunately, cannot be held. So please support the Celtic Cultural Alliance, and really grateful for this opportunity to gather with you. What I have been asked to do with you by the good people of the Celtic Cultural Alliance is to talk a bit about hagiography. And over the course of the next 4 weeks, we will, in these short videos, meander a bit around the topics of hagiography. And in a moment's time, I will define hagiography for you. But first, I feel like I should tell you how it is that Anthony Rocco Pompa, an Episcopal priest, has come into appreciation and discovery of the influences of Celtic things. And that is to tell you that I, on my maternal side of genetics and formation and life, am the grandson of Welsh people. And in a time a few years ago of my own reflection and given a sabbatical experience, I wandered into the exploration for my own renewal of life and spirit, the connections of generations past, the things that have been passed on that live inside of me, and the search for the connections of my own life and worldview and commitment to living life as handed down. And so I took a sabbatical time to connect with my own family history, and particularly because I'm an Episcopal priest, the pieces of that life that are formed in faith, which are all of it. And it was in that moment that I, reconnecting with my Welsh heritage, found myself traveling to Wales, where my great-grandparents immigrated from, to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, which many of you may or may not know, was at a certain point in the United States history, had the largest concentration demographically of Welsh people in the United States of America. I don't know if that's still true. So I found myself traveling to Wales, and I had the good opportunity to spend some time in residence and in conversation and in study with Esther Duvall, the prolific writer of all things Celtic. You can Google Esther Duvall, Dewaal. You can Google her if you are not familiar with her and her writings. And so such was my discovery on a pilgrimage of sort into the world of Celtic spirituality, which I came to an acute awareness, is something that just lives in us. It just lives in us. So that is a piece of my story. My mother's maiden name is Parry, very common name for Welsh people. And so that's why I am here I am, and that's why I am. Despite the biographical information posted on the lovely website for the Culture Alliance, I am by no means an expert on anything. I am, however, devoted to the influences of the Celtic experience. And so, as we transition here and talk a little bit about hagiography itself, I always find it's important just to do a little bit of context. When we say the word even Celtic, we are talking about a culture influenced by nomadic peoples who in history found their ways and settled in places that we now kind of claim as Celtic places. Those places where people with a Celtic experience and worldview settled. In today's world, we would know as Ireland and Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, of course, Cornwall, which is the southern tip of England, and Brittany, which in history was part of France, or in modern day now, a piece of Spain even, and France. So when we refer in our journey together in this study of hagiography, when we begin to examine the lives of saints, we will be talking about people who made their life in those particular geographical contexts. Northern Ireland, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, of course, Cornwall, and Brittany. As we make our lives in our way in discovering these different experiences of hagiography and writings in hagiography of saints, I will, over the next 4 weeks, vary the saints as we talk about them so that we can have little samples of saints who lived in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany. Great. So what is hagiography? Seems like a good place to start. What is hagiography? Hagiography is the writing of the lives of saints. The word hagi, if we break the word apart, hagi or hagi is Greek, comes from the Greek word which means holy. And of course, you know, agraphy means about the holy. This is about the lives of holy ones. The discipline of hagiography does not only apply to saints, but in the definition, Merriam-Webster definition of hagiography, it actually misspeaks, describing hagiography as a biography that idealizes its subjects. You will hear from me as we make our way through this exploration of hagiography, that hagiography, particularly of the lives of the saints as we have inherited them, might have some elements of biography, but hagiography is a far cry from biography, meaning not historical, although there are elements of history in the hagiographies that we have received. So I like to say that hagiography are works or accounts of saints' lives with particular focus on the work or the witness and the influences of these saints. Hagiography are absolutely based on saints' lives. They focus on spiritual and cultic ritual, and often, if not always, have a focus on the supernatural or the miraculous, and I'm going to tell you why shortly. Here's the thing about hagiography. All hagiographies were written well after the saints themselves historically lived, written generations later. Hagiographies are important because they provide us with valuable insight into the institutional and local history, and particularly point to the cults, the customs, and the traditions. And in fact, hagiographies were written to help make those connections many years later in a particular context or in a place, to make those connections to justify or establish or make the cause for cultic practices, and even sometimes political influence. Hagiography is not in its nature what it is not. By its very nature, they're not works of history. But again, you'll find little elements of history. So for example, and we're going to talk about this today, the 7th century hagiographers, Tirchen and Murchu, were hagiographers of St. Patrick, who we're going to talk about today. Tirchen, we believe, he himself claims to have been the son of Cogistus, who wrote a work called Vita, which is a hagiographical account of St. Bridget of Ireland. We'll also talk about her today. Tirchen and Murchu, their hagiographical works were written in the 7th century about Patrick, who we know lived in the 5th century. So a couple hundred years later, they were writing about Patrick. And what they write has elements of Patrick's factual life, picked, we believe, from actual documents we know by scholars that were written by Patrick himself. His Confessio is his own story about his own conversion and life and his relationship with God and Jesus and his life in the church. That is his Confessio. That is written by his own hand. Our hagiography friends, Tirchen and Murchu, have elements of the Confessio in it. But they were writing with an agenda in the 7th century. One particular was to create a legitimacy around the cultic practice assigned to a monastic community. Often hagiography was written for that purpose, to legitimize an establishment of a monastic community. It may have been a new monastic community, it may have been a monastic community that had been in existence for some time, but in the world order of church and politics was looking to establish itself as more primary. This was true for Tirchen and Murchu, particularly for Tirchen in his hagiography of St. Patrick. In his hagiography, he is trying to make the connection of St. Patrick as a saint who, in his own cultic monastic practice, would bring legitimacy to the monastic community being established in Armagh, a different part of Ireland. So he goes to great extremes to make the connection between Patrick and Armagh. That's one reason for the hagiography. The second reason is just quite simply in a world and in a time where, particularly in the church, where saints were being raised up and edified and brought legitimacy, it was almost a competition of saints. Who has the more powerful saint? Who has the more meaningful saint? Who has the more clout-filled saint? Because that brings legitimacy, right? So the second reason for the hagiography, it was to elevate Patrick amongst those 5th century peregrinatio, peregrini, missionary pilgrims of the 5th century movement, who were folk who got into those rickety boats and headed off because they believed Jesus was asking them to do that. So Columcille in Scotland, for example, and Columbanus, who was considered the epic Peregrini. Patrick was being elevated. They did a great job, didn't they? Because we kind of know Patrick, right? Columbanus, I have to tell you about, right? Columcille, you know. So the hagiographers succeeded in establishing St. Patrick and elevating him. So good job, Tirchin and Ruchu. And the final thing that you will find in most hagiographical work, hard word, 7th, 8th century, looking back to the 5th century, in the Celtic world, which, of course, the Christian Celtic world emerged out of Druid Bard influenced world, which very heavily relied upon, and you see it in Celtic spirituality, around the natural order of things: the moon, the sun, the stars, the land, the ocean, the trees, the grass. Our connection and relation with that comes from the Druid and Bard world. You also find good things about that written in the book of Genesis. But also a supernatural kind of worldview that is what we would call almost magical today. So it's almost Christian apology. Hagiography is almost Christian apology in that 7th century, writing about 5th century folk, the stories of the miraculous around these saints are stories directly related to compete with the Druid and Bard world. That these people of Jesus Christ are the folk who, at the end of the day, represent the God of all power, right? So you will see in the hagiography some of the wild stories about the saints having power over the forces of nature. The difference is that in the hagiography, those stories will echo the stories we find in the New Testament of Jesus and Jesus' power over the supernatural order and the natural world, right? So you will have saints calming storms, for example, and you will have saints always healing, like Jesus healed, always healing. And again, that is an apologist standpoint in a world influenced by Druid and Bard thought. So, right, so hagiography tied cultic practices to monastic communities looking to elevate themselves in attention and in power. Hagiographies established the saints in competition with one another. It was good for pilgrims to be on pilgrimage, to want to go see the shrines of Patrick. And the third is the apologist viewpoint of making the Christian statement in the midst of a Druid and Bard worldview. Hagiography. There you have it. So let's talk just a little bit about let's just talk a little bit about the saints behind me. Let's talk a little bit from a hagiographical standpoint about Patrick and about maybe Bridget. Just a few words. I'm mindful of videos and how long they can get. So, what we know, for example, what we know about Patrick. We know from Patrick himself. I'm looking for a note here. I'm so sorry. Just give me 1 second here and I will find the right note here. Right. So what we know from Patrick himself, from his confessio, from his own writings, is that he was born. He was born in the year 415 AD. We know that his father was Copornius, who he tells us in his confessio was a deacon in the church, and in those days living in communal village gatherings, small. A deacon would have been a bit different than what we might know deacons today, for those of you who are churched people. A deacon would have been one who looked out for the poor in that community. We know that from his confessio, his own writing, that he tells us he was kidnapped at age 16. Some of you will know this story. Who sold him into slavery in Ireland. Most scholars believe that he was living in modern day United Kingdom, England. Us Welsh people like to say he was living in Wales. I think that's true. But he was kidnapped, he tells us, when he was 16, sold into slavery in Ireland. And he worked as a shepherd, he tells us in confessio, until he escaped back to his family. He himself, like his father, he tells us, became a deacon and then a priest. And then at some point in his own confession, he tells us that he had a vision that instructed him to go and bear witness to the pagans. At some point, he writes that he made his way in the church. Again, you have to realize the church was very small, particularly in the far reaches away from Rome, where they lived Christianity very differently back in the far reaches, almost the ends of the earth. You have to think about the British Isles, where our friend was, and then Ireland and Northern Ireland. He becomes a leader in those small communities, a bishop. And he writes himself about how he baptized thousands of people. He also, we know, states that he had relations with chieftains and kings, and that he was very politically savvy. He knew how to keep the status quo. He also writes in his confessio a pretty common theme of humility. He describes himself as a simple person. He describes himself as a sinner. He describes his own feeling that he feels many look down upon him. And scholars believe that a fair amount of that writing is also the reality that this is worthy of a saint's life, is a good spirit of humility. So those are kind of the things we factually know about Patrick, his own writings. We know that as a bishop in those days meant that he had oversight of a monastic type of community, and that he said his prayers, and that he had cultic ritual practices. And the hagiographies talk, this is the hagiography part. The hagiography part talks about his true nature of humility and his discipline to prayer, praying many hours a day, crossing himself thousands of times during the day, all things to elevate his piety as a saint. Those hagiographical comments also talk about his discipline, or his rule of how it is that he and those who lived with him kept a discipline of prayer throughout the day. Some of it very extreme, actually. And this writing would be for that purpose, tying it back to our original statement of the cultic practices attached to a monastic community, and to elevate him as a worthy saint to be followed. St. Patrick was asked once, and this is in the hagiographical, he was asked, who is God? And in his response of who is God, he answered in this way. And this is how we understand him living in the Celtic world of druids and bards who were connected to the natural world. And his apologist approach, that is, he's making the case for the Christian worldview into this druid bard worldview. So he says, our God is the God of all, the God of heaven, the God of earth, the God of the sea, the God of the rivers, the God of the sun, the God of the moon, the God of the stars, the God of high mountains and low valleys, the God above heaven, the God in heaven, and the God under heaven. For those of you who know St. Patrick's breastplate, God above me, God below me, God beside me, God within me. You can hear it. God has a dwelling in heaven and earth and sea and in everything that is in them. God breathes in all things, makes all things alive, surpasses all things, supports all things, illuminates, turns on the light of the sun. He consolidates the light of the night and the stars. He has made wells in the dry earth and dry islands in the sea and stars for the service of the major lights. So you see the God of all the natural order there. And you hear the apologist making the case for the Christian view in a Celtic Druid bard worldview. There is a hagiographical moment in the writing of St. Patrick as well that illustrates St. Patrick in a moment of time, quieting a storm, standing on a seashore with those who are around him in fear because of the impending storm that is coming at them. And as the story goes, it is Patrick who, through his prayer and through his movement, calms the storm. And again, you can hear also the story of Jesus out on the sea with his disciples, calming the storms. My favorite hagiographical story about St. Patrick, one that connects the miraculous, mysterious with the supernatural, natural world, is a story about Patrick and his followers on the Feast of Imbolc, which is in the Celtic, pre-Christian Celtic world, a festival of lighting fire as the season grows darker. And the fire is lit, great fires were lit, so that the living and the dead could see one another. And it was a great cultic practice in Patrick's time to build fires, and there were pagan, of course, Druid, bard fires. And the Christian Patrick and his friends, the hagiographical account goes, built the biggest fire, which the local chieftain king was offended by. So offended by, and you can hear the narrative in it, that Christ's light is so much brighter than the Druid pagan life. You can hear that. This is what this is about. This story, the local pagan chieftain was very upset that Patrick's fire was so much brighter. And so he ordered his men to find Patrick and his friends and to kill them. And this hagiographical account goes is that they sought and chased them down. And Patrick, standing on a hillside as they were growing closer, prayed a prayer of preservation to God, and God turned his friends and himself into a deer, or into deer, so that when the chieftain king came by, all they saw were the gentle, graceful deer grazing in the grass, and they passed them by. Out of this hagiographical account, you can hear the Christian apologist making the case for the Christian world in a pagan world. Out of this came the ritual hymn called the Deer Cry. Also an abbreviated way, what we call today St. Patrick's Breastplate. And I will read this to you today, and you will hear it. I bind unto myself today the strong name of the Trinity. By invocation of the same, the three in one and one in three. This, by the way, it is said, is the prayer that Patrick was saying when he was turned into a deer. I bind this day to me forever by power of faith, Christ's incarnation, his baptism in River Jordan, his death on the cross, his bursting from the spiced tomb, his riding up the heavenly way, his coming at the day of doom. I bind unto myself today. And these familiar words, Christ be with me, Christ within me, Christ behind me, Christ before me, Christ comfort and restore me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ in quiet, Christ in danger, Christ in hearts and all that love me, Christ in mouth of friend and stranger. That is called the Deer Cry, and that is the hagiographical story that it is attached to, which again is Christian apology. A quick note about St. Bridget. I also am going to try to be intentional about pointing out that in the Celtic tradition, as early as the 5th century, that women played a role, not just in their own faithfulness, but in leadership. And St. Bridget was one of those great saints. It is said St. Bridget, who lived as a contemporary to St. Patrick, was influenced by Patrick, that she herself was the daughter of a local chieftain, that she herself had a conversion experience thanks to her relationship with St. Patrick, and that because she was related to the local powers that be, that she was granted a tract of land to be able to establish a monastic life. And that tract of land was located in what is known today as modern day Kildare, just maybe an hour's and so west of Dublin. It is said that she established a group of women in a monastic community, and that she was the overseer of that monastic community. In modern day, some scholars like to believe, suggest that that would have made her a bishop in the church as the overseer, which is what bishop actually means functionally. Bridget's hagiographical story also demonstrates not just the connection of Bridget elevating her so that she could be a saint among saints and justify the monastic community founded there in Kildare. Again, the hagiographical work succeeded because there is, until this day, a cathedral in St. Bridget's name in Kildare, and a healing well and a shrine. So bravo, hagiographies. Some of the fun stories, just two fun stories, hagiographically. Again, as an apologist, 7th century, writing by the 5th century person, Christian worldview in the midst of a pagan, Druid, bard worldview, is the story of Bridget's healing power. And there was a particular woman who lived in Bridget's community, and she was blind, and there was the most beautiful picture of sky happening around them, and they were together, and Bridget was so brokenhearted that her friend could not see, that she made the sign of the cross over this woman's two eyes, and her eyes were opened and she could take in the beauty. Again, obviously mimicking the story of Jesus' healing. The other story is associated with Bridget, and this is the icon of Bridget, and the other is associated with the cross that Bridget is holding, also known very much as St. Bridget's cross, made from the thrushes of that which was on her floor. And the story of that goes is that the local chieftain was dying, and that the local chieftain had not converted to Christianity, and that Bridget, in visiting the local chieftain, began to slowly, in her prayer, reach down and pull the thrushes off the floor and slowly weave together the cross of Christ. And the local chieftain actually, through the conversation and the making of the cross, was converted and was healed. Short version of that story. This is the kind of hagiographical story that you get. That, again, the important point, both in Patrick and in Bridget, and in the rest of the saints that we will explore together, you will hear those three kind of points of hagiography, right? The 3 points. So one is to create a cultic legitimacy, typically around a monastic setting. Second is to elevate that saint to be a saint worthy of attention and pilgrimage. And the third is the Christian apology, making the case for the Christian worldview in a worldview very much influenced by the pagan, Druid, and bard worldview, which was tied to nature, the natural order of things, and a supernatural power in that. And again, In hagiography, you will hear some wild stories, but those stories will mimic the stories of Christ. Friends, we're 40 minutes, and that is a long time to be watching a video. So, a couple of things. Next week, we will explore some saints, perhaps. Maybe we'll go to Wales next week. We'll see. And explore some hagiography of saints in Wales. If you have questions about anything hagiography, if you have questions, email me at tpompa@nativitycathedral.org. That is tpompa, T as in Tony, Pompa, P-O-M-P-A, at nativitycathedral.org. If you have questions, email those to me. Or if you have a story to share, email it to me, and I will do my best to respond, and may do it by video so that your questions get elevated. So, thank you, my friends. Really grateful to be with you. I look forward to being with you next week. Again, we're grateful to the Celtic Cultural Alliance, who do such a wonderful work in keeping the Celtic heritage and culture, and the good spirit of what that does for us in community alive. So support them. Blessings to you, my friends, and we will see you soon.